I just finished my PhD in British history at Manchester University, and the field was popular literature and empire. And my supervisors at Manchester were, one was in the history department, the other was in the English department. So I was kind of interested in the English popular press. And I had noticed that several of the juvenile novels for boys and magazines like the Boys' Own Paper were featuring stories about plucky young Britons finding their fortune in the Dominion of Canada. The hero of the story would go on and make his fortune, and along the way he'd meet a remittance man who a remittance man typically had gone to a British public school or a private school, we call it, but had turned out wrong, and he gambled or drank, and he was kind of the foil for the hero. And I gave a paper on this to the CHA, and it was entitled Tom Brown on the Prairie. And Lewis G. Thomas, an eminent Alberta historian, came up to me afterwards and he said, you know, that's quite a story you're pointing towards. It's a significant part of Canadian history, and it hasn't been told. And when I got back to Victoria, I got a phone call from Scott McIntyre. Well, here's a contract. Can you do a book within a year? And I had never done a book before, and I said naively, oh, sure. I managed to meet the deadlines, but I was going into areas that I wasn't initially familiar with. But once I got into the terrain, it was an interesting topic, and a lot of people would share anecdotes about remittance men that they had known. And so there's one chapter in the book about remittance men, but I wanted to say that the remittance men were part of that larger middle to upper middle class group of L.G. Thomas called them privileged settlers. Came out to Canada with some capital, with some money. They knew the language. They knew our system of government. And so that became Gentlemen Emigrants. And then I followed up with a couple of articles on those books that had kind of led me there. And I was mentioning to you, they came up with titles like Sturdy Young Canadian or A Boy of the Dominion. These books were often given as prizes in schools for attendance, or as Sunday school for proficiency in scripture. Most of them have a book plate, and they'll say to so and so for in recognition of your scholarship. And some of those institutions, some of the British public schools, actually opened training schools for their alumni in Western Canada. Two schools in particular they bought ranches in Alberta with the idea that their old boys, graduates, would come out and they would train in Canadian conditions and then become ranchers on their own. And I should point out that ranching was by far the most desirable occupation. They didn't want to become grain farmers. They didn't want to become farmers. And in addition to ranching, their other favored profession would have been what they call fruit ranching, being orchardists. And I should point out here, this was really a good kind of historical geography lesson, because I could, after a while, recognize where you'd likely find gentlemen emigrants in Canada. Interestingly, there were several themes in the literature I'm talking about that dealt with that, and they were cautionary tales. So they would say to would-be young and naive immigrants, look, be careful you're not swindled by real estate speculators who will prey on you and take your money, and then you'll never see it. And so many of his stories involved a young man, and he's about to be taken advantage of by some sharpster in Winnipeg or Vancouver, and a solicitous older hand will take him aside and say, "Son, I think you should just save your money for a year before speculating in real estate, because the real estate bubble could burst." And of course it did. But real estate speculation was certainly a theme in some of these books.